In September 1940, while Britain was fighting for its life, a squadron of Polish pilots who had already lost their country joined the RAF. They were called 303 Squadron. In just 42 days of combat, they shot down 126 German aircraft, the highest kill rate of any squadron in the Battle of Britain. When the war ended, Britain excluded them from the Victory Parade. That sequence of facts should bother you. It should bother you the way a broken promise bothers you, not as some abstract historical injustice, but as something specific and personal and wrong. Because this isn't simply a story about brave pilots doing brave things. It's about what happens when a nation owes its survival to men it later decides are politically inconvenient. This story comes in two acts. The first will make you admire them. The second should make you ashamed. Both are true. To understand what 303 Squadron achieved in British skies, you have to understand what these men had already survived before they ever set foot on an English airfield. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the Polish Air Force was overwhelmed. Not because its pilots couldn't fly, because their aircraft were obsolete. PZL P.11 fighters, high-wing monoplanes with open cockpits and fixed undercarriages, going up against Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Imagine bringing a bicycle to a Formula One race. Despite that suicidal mismatch, Polish pilots shot down 285 German aircraft in 5 weeks before their country ceased to exist. These weren't cadets. Many had thousands of hours in the cockpit. Many had already killed. And when Poland fell, they didn't surrender. They couldn't. They ran, through Romania, across the Balkans, into France, and enlisted with the French Armée de l'Air, flew Morane-Saulnier and Squadron fighters against the same Luftwaffe that had already destroyed their homeland. Then France collapsed in 6 catastrophic weeks. So they ran again, by boat from French ports, through North Africa, converging on Britain as men who had now lost 2 countries and were burning, absolutely burning, to fight for a third chance at the enemy that had taken everything from them. Think about that journey for a second. Warsaw to Romania, to France, to Britain. Months on the road, forged papers, hostile borders. Some walked across mountain passes in winter. Some bribed their way onto cargo ships. Some spent weeks in internment camps before escaping those too. By the time they reached English soil, they'd crossed half a continent as fugitives. And every single one of them, upon arrival, asked the same question. When can I fly again? By the summer of 1940, pilots like Witold Urbanowicz, Jan Zumbach, Miroslav Feric, Zdzisław Henneberg and Witold Łokuciewski had more combat experience against the Luftwaffe than almost anyone in the Royal Air Force. The RAF didn't see combat veterans. The RAF saw foreigners. Number 303 Squadron was formally established on August 2nd, 1940 at RAF Northolt, just northwest of London. Named the Kosciuszko Squadron after Tadeusz Kościuszko, the Polish hero who'd also fought in the American Revolution. A deliberate echo, Poles fighting for other nations' freedom. That was already the tradition. The squadron flew Hawker Hurricanes under the nominal command of squadron leader Ronald Kellett, a British officer. But its operational soul was Polish, led by flying officer Urbanowicz, who'd soon take command himself. And then the RAF made them sit. The reasons weren't entirely irrational, but they were applied with a rigidity that bordered on contempt. The language barrier was real. Radio communications ran in English, and the Poles' command of the language was basic at best. RAF tactical doctrine revolved around the standard VIC formation, 3 aircraft in a rigid V shape, a textbook arrangement that looked elegant on paper and was dangerously unsuited to the swirling chaos of actual air combat. The Poles had learned their tactics the hard way, over Warsaw, over France. They favoured aggressive, flexible, break-and-pursue fighting that looked reckless and undisciplined to British eyes. And there was snobbery. Quiet. Institutional. The unspoken assumption that pilots from a defeated air force, flying borrowed machines in someone else's country, couldn't possibly match proper RAF men. So 303 Squadron sat through training flights and formation drills while, over southern England, other squadrons were being bled white. Fighter Command was hemorrhaging experienced pilots at a rate that threatened to lose the entire war. And the men with more Luftwaffe combat time than anyone in Britain were being told to practice their turns. That absurdity ended on the 30th of August 1940. During a routine training exercise, Flying Officer Ludwik Paszkiewicz spotted a formation of Messerschmitt Bf 100s, twin-engined heavy fighters the Luftwaffe used as escorts. He radioed squadron leader Kellett. No response. So Paszkiewicz did what 2 wars' worth of combat instinct demanded. He broke formation, dived on the enemy, and shot a Bf 110 out of the sky. The RAF might have called it indiscipline. The Poles simply called it being a fighter pilot. And it was unanswerable proof that these men didn't need more training. They needed to be let loose. The next day changed everything. August 31st, 1940, 1 year to the day after Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. 303 Squadron was declared fully operational and flew its first sanctioned combat mission. In that single engagement, they shot down 6 German aircraft in 15 minutes, without losing a man. Now, the Poles were flying Hurricanes, not Spitfires, and the Hurricane Mark I deserves a closer look, because understanding the machine helps explain what made the Polish pilots so lethal in it. The Hurricane was powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin III engine, producing roughly 1,030 horsepower, a solid power plant, but one with a significant weakness. Its carburettor used a float-type fuel delivery system. Push the aircraft into a sudden negative G manoeuvre, a sharp bunt, a rapid pushover into a dive, and the fuel supply would momentarily starve. The engine would cough, splutter, sometimes cut out entirely for a few critical seconds. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E, by contrast, ran Daimler-Benz fuel injection. A 109 pilot could slam his stick forward and dive away without hesitation. His engine wouldn't miss a beat. In a pure energy fight, dive, extend, climb, repeat, the 109 held every advantage. It was faster in level flight, faster in a dive, and its fuel-injected engine gave it escape options the Hurricane simply couldn't match. On paper, the Hurricane was the inferior aircraft. But the Poles didn't fight on paper. What the Hurricane could do, and what the 109 couldn't, was turn. At low and medium speeds, the Hurricane's wide, thick wing generated enormous lift, allowing it to pull tighter turns than anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. The 109's controls stiffened badly at higher speeds, and its turning circle was wider at any speed. The Poles had fought 109s over Poland. They'd fought them again over France. They understood the machine's habits the way a boxer understands an opponent's footwork, not from manuals, but from scars. They knew that if you could force a 109 into a turning fight below 300 miles per hour, you owned him. And they knew how to compensate for the carburettor problem. Rather than pushing into a negative G dive, they'd half-roll the Hurricane inverted and pull back on the stick, converting the manoeuvre into a positive G pull-through that kept the fuel flowing. It was a simple trick, but you had to know why you were doing it, and doing it under fire while tracking a target required reflexes that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Their other edge was range discipline. The Hurricane carried 8.303 Browning machine guns, each firing 1,150 rounds per minute, over 9,000 rounds per minute combined. At distance, those .303 rounds lacked the punch to bring down an armoured aircraft reliably. The Poles solved this by refusing to fire at distance. They closed to point-blank range, inside 200 yards, sometimes inside 100, before squeezing the trigger. At that convergence, 8 streams of fire hitting a single concentrated point would tear through anything. Their philosophy was simple and violent. Get close enough that you can't miss, then give it everything. British pilots who flew alongside them described it as terrifying to watch. Effective. Undeniably effective, but terrifying. And then there was the head-on attack. Standard RAF wisdom said you didn't fly straight at a formation of bombers. The Poles did, repeatedly. Coming in from the front at a combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, firing all the way, braking at the last possible second. It demanded iron nerve and the kind of fatalism that comes from having already lost everything. The psychological effect on German bomber crews was enormous. Nothing rattles you like seeing a fighter coming directly at your cockpit with its guns blazing. The Hurricane's fabric and metal fuselage offered one more quiet advantage. Bullets often passed clean through the fabric without causing the kind of catastrophic structural failure that ripped apart all metal airframes. Hurricanes came home with holes that would have been fatal to other aircraft. They were repaired with patches and sent back up. The workhorse, not the glamour machine, but in the hands of pilots who understood exactly what it could and couldn't do, it became something devastating. What followed over those 6 weeks was one of the most remarkable combat records in the history of aerial warfare. Between 31st August and 11th of October 1940, the peak operational window of the Battle of Britain, 303 Squadron was credited with 126 enemy aircraft destroyed. Highest tally of any fighter squadron in the entire battle. Achieved in a fraction of the time most other squadrons had been operational. Look at the kill-to-loss ratio and it gets stark. Against those 126 claimed kills, 303 lost 18 Hurricanes. That's roughly 7-1. The RAF average during the Battle of Britain ran about 3-1. 9 of the squadron's pilots qualified as aces during this period, each with 5 or more confirmed kills. A necessary caveat. Modern historical analysis has revised those wartime figures downward. The fog of war made overclaiming universal across every air force. Multiple pilots firing at the same target, each recording a kill. Polish aviation historians, working with cross-referenced Luftwaffe loss records, place the verified number closer to 55 or 60 confirmed destructions. But here's the thing. Even stripped to that most conservative figure, 303 Squadron's kill rate still comes out on top. The claim holds whether you use the wartime numbers or the revised ones. It held by every measure Fighter Command applied at the time. It holds under modern scrutiny. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the man who commanded Fighter Command through the Battle of Britain, said it plainly. Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same. That wasn't diplomatic courtesy. That was the commander of the battle stating on the record that Poland's pilots may have been the margin between survival and defeat. The climax arrived on September 15, 1940. The date now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at London in two massive waves. That afternoon, 303 Squadron scrambled from Northolt and tore into them with characteristic aggression. The assault was broken apart over London and the surrounding counties. That single day convinced Hitler that air superiority over the Channel could not be achieved.
2 days later, he postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The squadron that had been too foreign to trust 6 weeks earlier had helped deliver the most decisive day of the battle that saved this country. Put faces to this. Real faces. The highest-scoring pilot of 303 Squadron and of the entire Battle of Britain wasn't actually Polish. Sergeant Józef František was Czech, a wild, brilliant aviator who had fought in Czechoslovakia, Poland and France before washing up in Britain and attaching himself to 303 because he preferred to fly with Poles. František was a lone wolf, constantly breaking formation to hunt on his own. 17 confirmed kills, more than any other Allied pilot in the campaign. On the 8th of October 1940, he died, not in combat, a landing accident at Northolt. He was 26. Survived 3 air forces and 3 countries' defeats, only to die on a runway in Middlesex. That 303 attracted a Czech who chose Poles over every other option, tells you something about what that squadron was. A place for men who had nowhere left to go except towards the enemy. Flying officer Witold Urbanowicz, born March 30th, 1908 in Olżanka, northeastern Poland, became commanding officer on September 5th, 1940. 15 confirmed kills. 4th highest-scoring ace of the entire Battle of Britain. A graduate of the Polish Air Force College, class of 1932. After the battle, he flew with the United States Army Air Forces in China against the Japanese, one of the very few pilots in history to have fought on both European and Pacific fronts. Remember his name: Jan Zumbach, Miroslav Ferić, Zdzisław Henneberg. All 4 of them, Urbanowicz, Zumbach, Ferić, Henneberg, appear in that famous photograph at Northolt. 4 young men in flying gear, standing on English grass, squinting at an English sky they would shortly fill with burning German aircraft. Ferić kept a diary, one of the most vivid first-hand accounts ever written of the squadron. The tension of waiting for the scramble bell, the savage brevity of air combat, the dark humour of men who understood the odds against their own survival. They were not fighting for king and country, they were fighting for a country that no longer existed. Fueled by a grief and a fury that no British pilot, however brave, could quite match. Every German aircraft they shot down was a small act of revenge for September 1939. Every kill was personal. So much for what they gave, now for what they got. Poland's contribution to Britain's war went far beyond one squadron. Polish mathematicians Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, Henryk Zygalski broke the Enigma cipher before Bletchley Park even existed. Polish forces fought at Monte Cassino, dropped at Arnhem, served alongside the Royal Navy. By war's end, roughly 250,000 Polish servicemen and women had served under British command, the 4th largest Allied military contribution in the European theatre. And Britain sold them out. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin carved up the post-war world. Poland, the country whose invasion had been the very reason Britain entered the war in September 1939, was placed squarely within the Soviet sphere. On the 5th of July 1945, Britain formally withdrew recognition from the Polish government in exile and recognized Moscow's puppet administration in Warsaw. With a stroke of a diplomatic pen, the government these men had fought for
simply ceased to exist. The Atlantic Charter, which Churchill and Roosevelt had signed in August 1941, proclaiming the right of all peoples to self-determination, was the most obvious casualty. Poland was the clearest test of those principles, and Poland was where they were most comprehensively shattered. Then came the parade. On the 8th of June 1946, London held its victory celebrations, a grand military procession through the streets of the capital. Americans marched, Canadians marched, Australians, South Africans, Free French, all marched. But the Polish armed forces, 250,000 men and women who had served under British command, who had bled at Monte Cassino and Arnhem and above the fields of southern England, were not invited. Not one of them. The stated reason was diplomatic. Poland was now represented by its Warsaw government, a Soviet client state, and inviting the Western Allied Polish forces would have been seen as a provocation to Moscow. The real reason was cowardice, dressed in the language of pragmatism. Clement Attlee's Labour government was determined to maintain relations with the Soviet Union, and unwilling to cause a diplomatic incident over a point of honour owed to men who no longer served any strategic purpose. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate decision, weighed against the calculations of the emerging Cold War, and resolved in favour of appeasing Stalin at the expense of men who had fought and died for Britain. The pilots of 303 Squadron, the men Dowding himself credited with potentially saving the Battle of Britain, were told, in effect, that their sacrifice was real, but their presence was inconvenient. The parade went on. The Poles were absent, and the debt began to compound. For the Polish servicemen who returned home after the war, what awaited them wasn't a homecoming, it was persecution. The communist government installed by Moscow viewed anyone who'd served with Western forces as politically suspect. Western agents, class traitors, symbols of the London exile government that Stalin had worked so hard to destroy. Their years in the RAF weren't a source of pride in the new Poland. They were evidence of ideological contamination. Veterans who went back found their RAF ranks stripped, British medals confiscated. Some faced interrogation by security services. Some were imprisoned. Some were sent to forced labour camps. The very service that Britain had asked of them became, under communist Poland, grounds for punishment. Britain didn't just fail to honour these men. By abandoning Poland to Soviet control at Yalta and then failing to protect those who'd served under its flag, Britain effectively sent men back into the jaws of a regime that would punish them for the very sacrifice Britain had demanded. For some of these pilots, Britain's abandonment wasn't symbolic, it was a sentence. And those who stayed? Their lives weren't much better, just quieter in their degradation. The Polish Resettlement Act of 1947 offered provisions for Polish veterans to remain in Britain. On paper, a gesture. In practice, deeply inadequate. Former fighter aces, men who'd been elite combat aviators, who'd held Britain's survival in their hands, found themselves working as farmhands, factory workers, hotel porters. Jobs far below their abilities and education, in a country where anti-Polish sentiment ran bitter. Taking British jobs, that was the phrase, directed at men who'd saved British lives. They built communities, maintained veteran organisations, married, raised families, grew old in a country that had needed them desperately once, and then preferred to forget they existed. Urbanowicz eventually settled in the United States, where he lived until his death on the 17th of August 1996. The fourth highest ace of the Battle of Britain, a man who'd fought the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese, ending his days far from both the country he'd saved and the country he'd lost. And then there was Zumbach. Jan Zumbach's post-war trajectory reads like a novel that nobody would believe. And it tells you everything about what happens to a man forged for war when the world decides it's done with him. After 1945, Zumbach tried civilian life. He genuinely tried. But what do you do with yourself when you're 25 years old, you've been one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the RAF, you've stared down Messerschmitts over London with your thumb on the trigger, and now peacetime Britain offers you a council flat and a job in a factory? Zumbach wasn't built for that life. Not because he was broken, because everything that made him extraordinary in the cockpit made him impossible on the ground. By the early 1960s, he'd resurfaced in Central Africa under the alias Mr. Brown. When the Katanga province attempted to secede from the newly independent Congo in 1960, Moise Tshombé's breakaway government needed an air force. They didn't have pilots. They didn't have aircraft. What they had was money from mining concessions and a willingness to hire anyone who could fly and fight. Zumbach, a man who'd spent 15 years looking for a war that still wanted him, answered the call. He organized and led a ragtag mercenary air force, scrounging aging aircraft wherever he could find them. Second World War-era trainers, transport planes jury-rigged for ground attack, Fuga Magister jet trainers fitted with machine guns and underwing rockets. It was improvised, dangerous, and frequently absurd. A former Battle of Britain ace directing combat operations from the cockpit of machines that belonged in museums. But it worked well enough to keep Katanga's secession alive for 3 years until United Nations intervention ended it in 1963. Zumbach didn't stop, couldn't stop. When the Biafran War erupted in Nigeria in 1967, he turned up again. Biafra, the breakaway southeastern region, was being strangled by a Nigerian federal blockade that was starving millions of civilians. Zumbach ran the airlift, flying supplies into besieged airstrips at night without lights, dodging Nigerian MiG fighters and anti-aircraft fire in overloaded cargo aircraft. Gun running, smuggling, relief flights that blurred into arms deliveries. The moral lines were tangled beyond untangling. But the flying was real and the danger was absolute. Several pilots on those Biafran runs were killed. This wasn't glory-seeking. It was the only life Zumbach knew how to live. One where the skills that had saved Britain still had currency, even if the markets where he spent them had become lawless and forgotten. He drifted through the 1970s and early 1980s in various murky aviation enterprises across Africa and Europe. The kind of work that doesn't appear in official records, and the kind of life that grinds a man down slowly, invisibly, in hotel rooms and foreign airfields, far from anyone who remembers what he once was. On the 3rd of January 1986, Jan Zumbach was found dead in his flat in Paris. He was 65. The circumstances were never fully explained. Some accounts suggest suicide. Others aren't so sure. What's certain is that one of the finest fighter pilots of the Second World War died alone in a foreign city, decades removed from the English skies where he'd once been indispensable. No government sent a representative to his funeral. From saving Britain to smuggling guns in Africa to dying alone in Paris. Not because he was a broken man. Zumbach was ferociously capable until the end, but because the world that made him a hero had no use for him once the heroism was done. He wasn't unique. He was the most dramatic example of a pattern that repeated across hundreds of Polish veterans' lives. Men shaped by extraordinary circumstances, discarded when those circumstances changed, left to find their own way in a world that owed them everything and offered them nothing. The question hangs there, decades later. Has Britain ever properly acknowledged this? There's a Polish war memorial at RAF Northolt, the very airfield from which 303 Squadron scrambled against the Luftwaffe. There have been gestures in recent years, occasional statements from officials. A 2018 film called Hurricane attempted to tell the 303 story, though with mixed results. The 70th anniversary of the Battle of Britain in 2010 brought some renewed attention to Poland's contribution. But a formal apology? A genuine national reckoning? Nothing that matches the scale of the betrayal. A memorial plaque doesn't settle a debt like this. So here is what happened. Men lost their country in September 1939.
They escaped across a continent, fought for France, lost France, escaped again. They arrived in Britain as refugees, were told they weren't good enough to fight, proved they were the best fighter pilots in the entire battle, helped save a nation from invasion, and were then told they couldn't march in the parade celebrating the victory they'd helped win. Some went home to prison cells. Some stayed and swept floors. One ended up running guns in the Congo and dying alone in Paris. Their government in exile was abandoned. Their homeland was handed to the very totalitarianism they'd spent 6 years fighting. And the country they'd saved looked the other way because Joseph Stalin might have been annoyed. This is not ancient history. The last veterans of 303 Squadron lived into the 21st century. Some of their children and grandchildren are watching this right now, in Britain, in Poland, scattered across the world. They know this story. They've been waiting for it to be told properly. Not as a footnote, not as a feel-good segment about plucky foreign pilots, as what it actually is. A debt unpaid. Witold Ulbanowicz, Jan Zumbach, Miroslav Feric, Zdzisław Henneberg, Ludwik Paszkiewicz, Witold Łokuciewski, Józef Franciszek, and every other man who climbed into a hurricane at Northolt and went up to fight for a country that wasn't theirs, because the country that was theirs had been taken from them. We should at least say their names. Subscribe for more stories like this.